My name is Rachel and this is Auxhart Gardening. Today I'm doing a video all about the absolute basics of watering your garden. When you're a new gardener, there can be a lot of questions around watering. When do you water? How much do you water? How do you know if your plants need water? Some plants need more water than others. How do you water? There's all of these things to consider, and so I just want to make a video for you guys who are just starting out to make it really clear when to water, how to water, what to think about when you're watering, all those things. Okay, so let's start off with how to figure out if your plants need to be watered. The general rule of thumb that a lot of people use, well, I guess rule of finger actually, is to stick your finger right into the soil up to the second knuckle depth. Yeah, you can see just about that far. And if you can feel dampness at the tip of your finger, then your soil is probably damp enough and you don't need to water. However, if you can stick your finger that far in and the soil still feels bone dry, then that's a sign that you probably need to water. Okay, so if you've determined that your garden or your plants do need water, how much do you water? That's a big question to address. And so different plants have different needs and people will tell you different things, but the general rule to follow is to water deeply such that you can get the soil to that point where it feels damp with the finger test a couple of minutes after you've watered. If you're not careful, you might end up just top watering and have that water not soak fully into the soil. So good rule to follow is to water for like 3 or 4 minutes. Make sure that the water is getting a chance to really soak down through the soil. Wait a minute or two and come back and check and make sure that the soil feels really evenly damp with the finger test. Alright, and so in that same vein, you should definitely prioritize watering less frequently but deeper as opposed to watering really shallowly very often. So what you want from your plants, right, is you want a deep, really well-established root system. And so if you're only watering a little bit at the top and you're not giving it that chance to soak all the way in, you're going to end up with the plant's roots looking for that water and staying right here on the surface. Whereas what you really want is you want them to actually go deeper and start searching for that water. So if you water really deeply, make sure the soil is really evenly moist. The roots will have a little bit more incentive to go downwards looking for that water, especially when the top little bit starts drying out. You can feel confident knowing that your plants have these roots all the way down here that still have access to water, even if right here at the surface is starting to evaporate, especially on really hot days. This is great peace of mind because you know that your plants have that stability and that water to access deep down. Okay, the next thing to think about is how to water. There are a lot of different methods that you'll see out there. The most common method, the one you probably use, is a nice little sprayer head on the end of your hose. There are other options if you get a little bit more serious. There are soaker hoses and drip irrigation and things like that. But in general, I think a lot of gardeners start out with their hose and their little sprayer. And when you have that hose and sprayer, your instinct is just to spray down everything in the garden, as in you're watering from the top down. And this isn't the worst thing you can do for your plants, but it's not ideal. First of all, you can kind of end up wasting a lot of water because all of that water gets on the leaves and then it evaporates off and your plants can't really soak up a lot of that, and so that's kind of a waste. But then the other thing is that when you're watering from the top, a lot of times what will happen is the water's coming in with such a velocity that it hits the soil and things kind of splash up onto your leaves. And that's not really ideal because there tends to be a lot of microbial life in the soil that can bounce up onto the leaves and cause disease issues. This is especially noticeable in tomatoes. A lot of people, you'll see they'll prune their tomatoes up so that the leaves aren't very close to the soil, so when it rains and that splashback occurs, there's less of a chance that something from the soil will splash up onto the leaves of the tomatoes, thus causing all of those yellow spots that you might sometimes see. So if you're watering with your hose and your sprayer, or maybe even just your hose, really prioritize getting that water right at the surface level as much as you can, rather than coming at it like rain from the top. All right, the next thing to address is when you should water your garden. There is an optimal time to water your garden, and it's actually early in the morning. So the logic behind this is that if you are watering a little bit from the top, you're not able to get it completely on the bottom, then you give those leaves a chance to dry off before the heat of the day and the sun comes and hits them. Something that can happen if you were to water your plants in the middle of the day and get water on the leaves is a little bit of sun scald, and this really stresses the plants out. They really don't like it. You can think about the water droplets on the leaves like tiny little magnifying glasses that just really magnify the sun onto the leaves, and can sometimes cause little scalds or burn spots on your leaves. And you might say, well, I'll just water at night then, in the evenings after the sun has gone down. That way there's plenty of time for the water to dry off before the sun comes up in the morning. And that's not the worst idea. It definitely can work, but in a lot of climates, especially a climate like mine where it's very humid, overnight without the heat of the sun, sometimes the water will sit on the leaves a lot longer than it should, and this again becomes a little bit of a breeding ground for those microbial life that can come up and splash up onto the leaves from the soil. So watering in the morning is really ideal because the sun is coming up, the day is warming up, and any water that gets on the leaves can evaporate off really quickly before the full heat of the sun starts hitting them, and before the microbial life really has a chance to establish a colony in that wet spot on the leaf. The next thing you might be thinking is it possible to water too much? And the answer is yes and no. It just depends on your situation. So in containers especially, watering too much, it can be a problem. And this is usually because containers don't have very good drainage out of the bottom. And so as you water, the water at the bottom slowly builds up, and then the roots become submerged in that water and start to rot because that's just too much for them. They need that oxygen flow coming through the soil. And if they're covered in water, they're not getting that, and then they start to rot. If you're gardening in a raised bed though, or in the ground, this isn't nearly as much of an issue because the drainage is usually really, really good, and no matter how much water you dump through, it's always going to be able to soak in. And of course that's up to a certain point. A lot of times when areas are getting a lot of rain and the water table is just higher in the soil, it can be easy to overwater. It can be easy for the rain to overwater your garden, and then cause flooding in the beds. It would be probably really, really hard to cause this kind of flooding on your own with just your own hose, as long as you have like good drainage through your soil. But even if that's not the problem, watering too much can leach nutrients out of the soil. So every time you water, you're kind of helping push nutrients from the surface down deeper into the soil. And to a certain extent, this is good. This is how a lot of nutrients are dispersed through the soil in a natural way. But if you're watering a lot, or maybe if you get a lot of rain, certain nutrients are really prone to leaching out of the soil beyond the reach of your plant's roots. So that's something to keep in mind, and that's a good reason to kind of hold to that finger test so that you know, okay, like I don't have to water today and there's enough moisture sitting in the soil. So even if you wouldn't necessarily be harming your plants by watering them more, you're not leaching all of those nutrients out of the soil faster than they need to be. Something else that can really help reduce the amount that you have to water, especially in the heat of the summer, is mulch. If you mulch the top of your raised beds or your garden in the ground or even your containers, you're doing a good job of kind of providing an evaporative barrier for the soil. Bare soil can evaporate out its water pretty quickly, and so if you have an inch or two of mulch on top of your soil, that really helps keep the moisture right at the soil level from evaporating. And overall, that means that deeper down in the soil as you go down, there's less and less chance of that evaporation happening. And so in the end, you just have to water less and your bed can stay more evenly moist, and you can focus on getting it those long, deep waterings less often. So with all of that said, all of these optimal ways to do things, I do want you to keep in mind that there is like the optimal way to do things that you're probably never going to reach all the time, and then there's like the good enough way to do things. And I want you to realize that as long as you're hitting that good enough, that's good enough. I mean, striving for the optimal watering all the time is not really realistic. And at the end of the day, if you see a plant that needs water and it needs it now, then it's better to give that plant that water, even if it's in like the middle of a hot day, than to not give it that water at all. So keep that in mind, that if your plants need water, give them water. Don't wait for that perfect moment to give them that water, because that is good enough, even if it's not optimal. But in that same vein of thought, in the middle of the day, sometimes it can look like your plants are like dying and really need water, when really they're just using their natural defense mechanisms because of the heat of the day, especially in the summer. This is really obvious with things like squash. If you look at them in the heat of the day, the sun is pounding down on them and they're like wilting really bad. That is not really a cause for concern unless you see later in the evening that it's cooled off and those leaves haven't perked back up. So resist the urge to water in the middle of the day if it's like the first time that you're seeing the plants look a little wilty, because a lot of plants will do this. They'll look really wilty in the middle of the day, and then they'll look a lot better in the mornings and the evenings when the sun isn't beating down on them so hard. And if you keep track of that, you can really avoid some overwatering issues that you might run into, thinking that your plants need more water when really they're just trying to get out of the heat of the sun. Alright, so those are some really general rules. There are plants in the garden that have a little bit more specific needs, either on the higher side of watering or the lower side of watering, and you can figure that out just by doing some research on your plants. Some common ones you might run into is peppers tend to want to be drier than most things in the garden, same with basil, but cucumbers and melons and stuff that's like high water content fruit is going to want more water than other things in the garden, especially during their fruit production stage, because you know those entire fruits are full of water. But in general, if you follow these rules, then for most things in your garden, you're going to see that they do okay. And if you do start seeing specific issues, then that's the time to go hit up the almighty Google and figure out if your plant has super specific watering needs. Right, and those are all of the basic tips that I can give you for watering your garden. If you have any questions, please do leave them in the comments below. My goal here is to help you as a new gardener just figure this stuff out, because it is a lot. It's a lot to take in, and watering in combination with like fertilizing and plant spacing and all of those other things that you have to think about, sometimes it can get really overwhelming. So please feel free to drop your specific questions in the comments below for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. But until then, happy gardening.